Welcome to the Restricted Handling Podcast. This is what's been going on in China in the past 24 hours. We talked yesterday about China leaning harder on tools short of force, trade, infrastructure, access, while avoiding direct confrontation. Today adds texture to that picture, especially with America's allies starting to move in ways that would have been politically radioactive not long ago. Canada is the clearest example. Prime Minister Mark Carney has now fully leaned into the idea that the global system isn't transitioning smoothly, it's fractured. After saying that out loud at Davos, he went straight to Beijing and finalized a trade arrangement that cracks open the Canadian market to Chinese electric vehicles while easing Chinese tariffs on Canadian agricultural exports. This is an update to a theme we've been tracking. Allies aren't abandoning Washington, but they are building economic shock absorbers. Beijing, for its part, played this cool. No grand rhetoric, no alliance talk, just a transactional exchange. Xi Jinping kept the language stiff and formal, signaling that China's open for business, not for saving anyone from American pressure. Britain is moving along a similar track, and today's developments really lock that in. London approved China's massive new embassy near the Tower of London, ending a 7-year saga that had turned into a diplomatic thorn. This is China's largest embassy in Europe, consolidating multiple sites into one huge compound. Yesterday, embassy politics were a side note in the broader China story. Today, they're central. British intelligence agencies publicly acknowledged the risks, spying, surveillance, influence, but said they're manageable. That public statement matters. It's London saying, we know who we're dealing with, and we're proceeding anyway. This decision directly clears the path for Prime Minister Keir Starmer's upcoming trip to Beijing and the revival of a UK-China business dialogue that's been frozen since the so-called Golden Era collapsed. Big British firms are lining up. Sensitive Chinese firms are still sidelined. This isn't trust, it's controlled exposure. Britain wants economic upside without pretending China isn't China. Now, flip perspectives to Beijing, because while China is pulling some allies closer economically, its global environment is getting rougher fast. Yesterday, we talked about the export model straining under weak demand and political backlash abroad. Today adds a geopolitical layer. U.S. actions in places China thought were relatively secure. Venezuela is the headline. The removal of Nicolás Maduro wiped out China's closest partner in South America, hit Chinese oil supply, and put billions in loans at risk. Chinese engineers are still embedded in Venezuela's energy sector. Chinese firms built telecom networks, and Chinese surveillance systems underpin internal control mechanisms. But now, all of that exists under an American-dominated reality. China can't muscle its way back in. It doesn't have the military reach, and even if it did, the political blowback would be severe. Iran tells a similar story. Instability driven by sanctions and military pressure is shaking another major Chinese energy supplier. Beijing is watching key supply lines wobble while having very few good response options. This is the downside of being globally invested without a global security architecture. The U.S. learned this lesson the hard way over decades. China is learning it now at speed. All of this feeds straight into the Xi-Trump dynamic. Multiple meetings are planned this year, including a summit in Beijing. China wants a trade deal and economic breathing room. But Washington is signaling that restraint isn't guaranteed, especially with threats of sweeping tariffs on countries trading with Iran. Beijing is trying to calculate how much resistance is too much and how much restraint just invites more pressure. That uncertainty bleeds directly into Asia, especially Taiwan. Yesterday, we talked about normalization around Taiwan, how surprise is basically gone. Today, the political side of that equation gets uglier. Taiwan's president proposed a massive 8-year defense spending plan, pushing military outlays above 3% of GDP. On paper, that's exactly what Washington wants. In practice, it's stuck in legislative gridlock. Opposition lawmakers are blocking the plan, pointing to constitutional disputes and delayed U.S. weapons deliveries. Fighter jets paid for, still waiting. That frustration is now part of domestic politics. So while China is rehearsing blockades and amphibious operations, Taiwan is fighting itself over budgets and process. That contrast is not lost on anyone in Beijing. On the military side, China's signaling hasn't let up. New footage and imagery show continued far-seas drills involving amphibious assault ships, destroyers, and logistics vessels. These aren't flashy one-offs. They include replenishment at sea, helicopter operations, landing craft, the mechanics of sustained pressure. One of these ships later participated in blockade-style exercises near Taiwan. This is about endurance and repetition, not shock and awe. The South China Sea remains the sharpest edge of this approach, and today's update builds directly on yesterday's warnings. Chinese forces expelled a Philippine government aircraft from airspace over Scarborough Shoal. Both sides released video. Both sides invoked international law. The notable update is the hardware involved. China didn't just send patrol ships. It deployed a major fleet replenishment vessel, usually tied to carrier operations. That's a signal about staying power. Manila responded not just with statements, but with capability. The Philippines has now taken delivery of a new offshore patrol vessel built in South Korea, equipped with modern sensors and a main gun designed for long-range patrols in contested waters. Beijing's response was unusually blunt, warning Philippine officials to stop provocations or pay the price. That language isn't accidental. It's meant to intimidate, but it also risks hardening resistance and locking the U.S. Mutual Defense Treaty more firmly into the picture. Beyond the maritime domain, China is deepening involvement in places that come with reputational and security risk. In Cambodia, Beijing is now publicly backing an intensified crackdown on cybercrime syndicates. Chinese officials praised arrests and extraditions of Chinese nationals and emphasized intelligence sharing. This is an update to yesterday's discussion about scam compounds and overseas exposure. The difference today is tone. China is no longer quietly cooperating. It's publicly pressing partners and framing these criminal networks as bilateral irritants. The darker side of overseas engagement is becoming harder to ignore. Europe is another front where yesterday's themes sharpened today. The EU is moving closer to forcing high-risk suppliers out of critical infrastructure: telecoms, energy systems, cloud services. Huawei is pushing back hard, accusing Europe of discrimination and protectionism. But the direction hasn't changed. If anything, it's more explicit now. Europe is checking IDs at the door, even as it keeps the bar open. Inside China, there's also continuity with yesterday's internal pressure story. A former senior intelligence official has been expelled from the Communist Party for corruption, accused of taking bribes and interfering in legal cases long after retirement. This reinforces the message we discussed yesterday. No one is ever fully retired, and loyalty doesn't expire. The anti-corruption campaign isn't cooling off. It's being refreshed, especially inside the security services. Thanks so much for listening and for being part of the RH community. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribing, leaving a quick 5-star review, or sharing it with someone you know makes a huge difference. It's how this network will grow. We also publish a daily written intel brief on Substack, where you'll find even deeper coverage of Russia and China, along with insights on Iran, the Middle East, and the DPRK.